I think so. Yeah, that's better. Okay, are we ready to get started, everyone? All right, can I have everyone's attention, please? Need everybody's attention. Hello, hello. Oh, are you ready? Just getting our camera set up. Yeah. Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. We have our presenter here, I just want to introduce myself first. My name is Brianna. I'm a community advocate here at GLAD. So today we have every single workshop from the Housing Rights Center. So we have our presentation that's going to be happening this morning. I hope you enjoyed it so much. We have a great presenter today. If you have any questions that you need answered, do you want that to happen during the presentation or at the end?
Let's save it for the end.
Okay, so that'll be at the end. So if you have any questions, please hold on to those and our presenter will be able to answer those at the end, okay? So that's all for the introduction, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and thank you so much for coming today. So just go ahead and stay here at the podium, and we're gonna have interpreters come up on the stage. If anybody needs the restroom, it's gonna be straight back through these doors, okay? And you'll be able to find it right outside. So thank you so much for coming today.
All right, so testing, hopefully you can hear me. So my name is Margot, and I'm really excited to be sharing this information with you today. So here's our agenda. This is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start with an overview about the Housing Rights Center, which is the organization that I'm a part of. And we're going to talk about some of our free services that are available for tenants, landlords, community advocates, and really anyone with a housing question. And then we're going to talk about what is fair housing. We're going to review federal and state fair housing laws. And we're really going to talk about who is protected through these state and federal fair housing laws. And we're really going to look at source of income discrimination, disability discrimination, and the right to request accommodations and modifications in our housing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of renting, specifically looking at allowable tenant screening criteria, harassment, and some eviction resources. And so now I want to share a little bit more about the Housing Rights Center. So we were actually founded in 1968, which is the same year that Congress passed the Fair Housing Act. And so that's really when it became illegal in the US for a landlord or a housing provider to discriminate against a tenant based on their protected characteristic. We're the nation's largest nonprofit civil rights organization dedicated to fair housing. And we serve LA County and Ventura County. And our services are free and available in many different languages. And so one of our main services that's really important for tenants, landlords, really anyone with a housing question to know about is that we offer free housing counseling. And so this is a free, private, and confidential service where you can reach out to our housing counselors with so many different types of housing questions. Questions like, how do I get my security deposit back? Or is it illegal to be treated differently in housing because I have children? Or what can I do if my landlord's not making needed repairs? So all of these are questions that you can reach out to our housing counselors with and get information on next step, resources, referrals, and really what you need to deal with that situation. So if you want to get in touch with our housing counselors, I do have our contact information on the screen here. It's also on every single flyer that we have in the back. So feel free to just grab a flyer or two on your way out and you'll have our contact information. If you prefer, you can always come in to our LA office. We're in Koreatown and we're open Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 5 p.m. for walk-ins. We also have a discrimination, investigation, and enforcement department. And what these departments can really do is if someone is being discriminated against, and we think that there is a case there, they can oftentimes investigate and help a tenant build up their case that they're really alleging discrimination. And so a really common thing that we help tenants with, something that this department does every single day, is helping tenants get their reasonable accommodation request granted. And so we're going to talk about that more today. And we're really going to look at what does the landlord need to consider when they're deciding, are we going to grant this request or not? We also have our outreach and education department, where we do a ton of free community workshops. And I want to encourage anyone who wants to learn more about all the activities that we're doing. An easy way to stay up to date is to sign up for email updates. I also want to highlight that we create something called Project Place every month. So Project Place is a free newsletter of affordable rental listings all around LA County and Ventura County. So we put this resource together every month just to help tenants who are looking for new housing on their search. It's free to download from our website, and you can always come into our main office and we'll print out a copy for you. I also want to highlight that we created a new resource called Project Place Toolkit, which is a much smaller guide. It's about 12 pages long. And essentially, it contains a lot of resources about the basics of renting, your rights when you're renting, what landlords can ask you about when they're screening, and a ton of helpful resources. All right, so now I want to talk more about fair housing. So this is normally the first question I get asked. What is fair housing? So the definition that I like to give for fair housing is really the ability for people of similar income levels to have available to them the same housing choices, regardless of personal characteristics or protected classes that we're going to talk about today, like race, national origin, disability, source of income, and really any characteristic protected through law. So why this definition is important is because a fair housing violation, something that we would really encourage you to report to our organization, is anything that's limiting your housing choice. It's limiting your ability to live where you want to live and can afford to live based on a protected characteristic. So when did these fair housing laws apply? that we only have these protections when we're an in-place tenant, when we're actually renting a unit. The truth is, we do have protections then, but we also have protections in so many different types of housing transactions. So we have protections when we're buying a home, taking out a loan, and lending from the bank. Or even if we're just a prospective applicant, even if we're just looking around, putting in an application at one property or talking with a leasing manager at another property, we can still experience discrimination at that stage that we should report. It also doesn't really matter what type of home or residential dwelling we're living in, we also have these protections. So we have protections in apartments, condos, houses, duplexes, residential motels, transitional shelters, mobile home parks, and even vacant lots if they were being used for housing. So what I have on the screen here are the federally protected characteristics. And this is through a federal law called the U.S. Fair Housing Act. And essentially, this means anywhere a tenant moves in the U.S., they would have these protections. So we have protections in housing against experiencing discrimination based on the following: our race, our religion, our color, which really means our skin tone, our national origin or ethnicity, our sex, which includes bans on sexual harassment, our familial status, which we're going to talk about more today, and if we have a disability. So once again, these are all federally protected characteristics through the U.S. Fair Housing Act. So familial status, what does familial status mean as a protected characteristic? It's essentially any household with a minor, someone under the age of 18, living in that household. It also covers households that are expecting the arrival of a minor. So maybe someone's pregnant, or they're going through the process of adoption, a grandparent's getting custody. In all of these situations, they could experience familial status discrimination. So what does familial status discrimination look like? Well, it can look like a landlord locating families in a certain part of the property. So maybe that landlord says families with small children, they can only rent these units in a corner part of that apartment complex. That would be an example of familial status discrimination because it's limiting their housing choice. It's limiting that household's housing choice based on a protected characteristic. It can also show up as unreasonable occupancy restrictions. So restrictions that say how many children can be in that unit rather than occupants, or restrictions that restrict how people are related in that unit. It often shows up as overly restrictive rules at the property that limit access to services and facilities for those households with minor children. So maybe there's a rule at the property that says all minors, have to be inside by 6 p.m. or they can't use these common areas that other residents are allowed to use. It can also show up as advertising statements, ads that say no children or adults preferred. That would be an example of familial status discrimination that we really encourage you to report. All right, so moving on now, national origin. So what does national origin mean as a protected characteristic? So it can mean our country of birth, like maybe we were born in a different country, but it can also mean ethnicity, which isn't always tied to one specific country. It covers our physical and our cultural traits, like our clothing and our hairstyles. It also covers our immigration and citizenship status. And lastly, it covers our primary language, or maybe if we speak English with an accent, all of that would be protected against discrimination through federal law. So some ways that national origin discrimination can show up would be if a landlord is denying a rental application based on that tenant's language or their accent. It can also look like a landlord charging a higher security deposit because that client's undocumented. Lastly, it can show up as a landlord or any of their agents working at that property harassing a tenant with ethnic slurs. If someone experienced any of that, I would really encourage you to contact us for next steps. All right, so moving on. Sexual harassment. So it is important to mention that the protections that we have based on sex also ban sexual harassment. Sexual harassment can include a lot of different forms of behavior. It could be physical, it could be verbal, or it could be visual. It's important to remember, though, that there's two forms of sexual harassment cases. So the first one is called quid pro quo, which translates to this for that. So there's an exchange happening there. The housing provider's offering something like reducing rent or stopping an eviction or doing needed repairs to a resident in exchange for sex. Of course, that would be illegal even if the offer was accepted because of the difference in power between a housing provider and a tenant. There's another form of sexual harassment called creating a hostile environment. Hostile environment sexual harassment occurs when behavior is severe and persistent enough that it interferes with the resident's right to enjoy their housing. So this can look like comments about the tenant or the harasser's body, their clothes, or inappropriate questions, or even persistent requests for dates. So what I have on the screen here are California's protected classes. So we've gone through the federal protected classes through the Fair Housing Act. But in California, we have everything that we've talked about so far, in addition to what we have on the screen here. So in California, we have a law called the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. And it grants us protections based on our ancestry, our sexual orientation, our gender identity and gender expression, our marital status, which would be if someone experienced discrimination because they're single, they're married, or they're widowed. We also have protections based on our military and veteran status, our medical condition, and lastly, our source of income. So source of income is a big one that I want to talk about today. And it's a big one because it's relatively new. So source of income was added as a protected characteristic. Essentially, it went into effect in 2020. So that means that a lot of tenants, a lot of landlords, we're all learning about what source of income discrimination can look like. So what do we mean when we say source of income is a protected class, just like our race is a protected class, or if we have a disability is a protected class? In California, all lawful sources of income, and what I mean by that is as long as the tenant is using a legal avenue to pay their rent, a landlord cannot use their source of income as a reason to treat them differently. So when we're talking about lawful sources of income, protected forms of income, we're talking about all public assistance, all public benefits, including Section 8 or housing choice vouchers, SSI, SDI, GR, rental assistance, rapid rehousing assistance, homeless prevention, security deposit assistance. All of these are lawful sources of income that a landlord cannot use as the reason to not rent to a tenant or make it more difficult for tenants to rent there. So what are some ways that source of income discrimination shows up? It can show up as a landlord advertising something like no Section 8. So in California, advertising no Section 8, that's no longer legal. So if we see that, we really want to report that to our organization. It can also be a landlord refusing to accept or approve applications from tenants because of their source of income, right? So they always refuse applicants who are using certain forms of income at that property. We're seeing a lot of situations where landlords now no longer saying, I'm not going to accept this tenant because of your source of income, but I'm going to make it more difficult for you to rent there. So I'm not going to fill out the required paperwork that would allow you to use your form of income at this property. That counts as discrimination that we would really encourage you to report. So I also want to highlight that we had a new law go into effect at the start of 2024. What that law is called is SB 267. So what this California law says is that landlords may not require a credit check for applicants who are using a government rent subsidy. So they're using something like Section 8 and they're applying to that property. They now have the option to provide alternative evidence instead of that credit check. So that's their right now in California. Some other ways that source of income discrimination can show up would be if a landlord charges a higher rent or has a tougher application screening process for tenants who are using certain forms of income. Lastly, I want to highlight it can show up as a landlord applying income standards incorrectly. So an income standard, it's that part of the application that says tenants have to make 2 times the rent or 3 times the rent to live here. That income standard, it is legal to have, it is valid to have, but it can only be applied to the portion of the rent that the tenant is personally responsible for paying each month. have an exercise here that I'm going to read through that talks about this example. So in this example, an apartment's renting for $1,000 a month. The application criteria requires an income of 3 times the rent. An applicant applies, though, who's making $300 per month at their part-time job, and they have a housing choice voucher, or Section 8, that's paying $900 per month. And so the question that we have, 900. And so the question that we have is, do we think that this applicant meets that income requirement? Are they making 3 times their rent and therefore qualify for that apartment? And what do we think? We could give maybe a thumbs up or yes or no. Do they qualify or no? What do we think? Yes, I'm seeing some yes, no. A few yeses, which is great. Some so-so, not sure. And so if you're thinking to yourself, yes, this applicant makes enough money to meet that income standard, you are correct. Why is that so? Well, that's because, once again, that income standard, it can only be applied to the portion of the rent that the tenant is personally responsible for paying. So in this example, the total rent was $1,000. They have a voucher that's paying $900, and so the applicant's personally responsible for $100 each month. That's what they have to pay each month. And because they have a part-time job where they're making $300 per month, they're technically making 3 times that $100, 3 times what they personally have to pay, and therefore their income qualifies them. So why we go through this is because if a landlord is rejecting applicants because they don't meet the income standard and they're applying it incorrectly, that counts as discrimination that we would encourage you to report. And I just want to say on this, sometimes we get the question, how would I prove the discrimination's really happening, right? So maybe I'm using something like Section 8, and I'm applying at a lot of properties, but I'm not getting accepted, and I don't know if that's the reason why. How would I be able to prove that, right? I'm not the landlord. So what I would say to that person is that we have a testing department at our office, and we're always looking for more testers. And essentially, testers are volunteer actors who go out to properties and test if discrimination is really occurring. So we're always in need of testers, people who are interested in making calls or going out to these properties, because essentially they help prove if discrimination is happening. So we would have a group, let's say, that's using Section 8 or pretending to use Section 8, and then a group that's not using Section 8. And we would see, is there a difference in treatment? So moving on now, I want to highlight a few other California laws that we have that give us additional protections. So tenants who have experienced domestic violence or other violent crimes that happen in the home, they can change their locks with little notice, and they can break their lease with lower penalties if they need to move elsewhere. We also have a law in California called the Immigrant Tenant Protection Act, which I'm going to talk about more in the next slide. We also have protections in California against experiencing discrimination based on our age. But age here really means over 40 years old. So anyone who's over 40 years old has protections against experiencing discrimination in housing based on their age. We also have protections against experiencing discrimination based on arbitrary reasons. Reasons that shouldn't really matter when they come to the housing. So an example is if a landlord told me, my name's Margot, right? And they told me, Margot, I'm not gonna rent to you because you're too tall, right? I'm 5'11", and they said, I'm not gonna rent to you because you're too tall. It's an arbitrary physical characteristic, shouldn't be taken into consideration, and therefore is discriminatory. We also have protections against hate crimes, and this last one on primary language essentially says that if someone speaks one of these 5 languages, Spanish, Chinese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, or Korean, they can bring an interpreter with them to help them understand their lease, or they can request a translated lease at no cost to the tenant. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit more about the Immigrant Tenant Protection Act. So this is a California law that prohibits landlords from reporting or even threatening to report tenants to the immigration authorities. So in California, that is not legal. Landlords are not allowed to disclose information that they may have related to a tenant's immigration status. So if this does happen to a tenant, the law provides them with recourse or options they can take. They have a legal defense against an eviction from that landlord, and they also have the right to sue their landlord called a private right of action. So I want to move on now to talk a little bit more about disability. So disability, as we remember, is a federally protected characteristic. And disability is really defined by the impact that it has on an individual. And that's really, really important in understanding the fair housing protections that we have under disability. So disability is defined by impact, and specifically the impact that it has on someone's major life activities, right? So our ability to see, hear, walk, breathe, perform manual tasks, care for ourselves, learn, and speak. On the right-hand side, or just for example, I have actual disabilities or diagnosis that people could have, right? So someone could have an orthopedic disability, cancer, heart disease, a substance use disorder. All of these are actual disabilities that people have. And why it's important to go through the difference is because to request an accommodation or modification in your rental housing, a change in your housing, you don't have to disclose the disability that you have. That's your private medical information. But what you often have to provide is a verification letter from a doctor normally that talks about the major life activity that's impacted by a disability. And so tenants or applicants with disabilities can request accommodations and modifications in housing. And so accommodations are changes to rules, changes to services, changes to policies at that housing that make it more accessible for tenants with disabilities. Modifications are physical changes to the unit or the building. And so this right to request accommodations and modifications is really to ensure that tenants with disabilities can get equal use and enjoyment out of their housing. So when a landlord gets a request, a reasonable accommodation request, we want something different in our housing, and we're requesting it because it's going to make it more accessible for us. There's only two things that the landlord can consider when they're deciding, does this request have to be granted? So there's only two. And the first thing that they can consider is, number one, is this request necessary for the tenant? Is it directly related to a disability that the tenant has and improves accessibility, quality of life, or safety for that tenant, or enables them to live here at all? And so at this stage, right, when the landlord is considering, is it necessary for the tenant? That's when they can request a verification letter that essentially tells the landlord it is necessary for the tenant. That verification letter, it should not include a diagnosis, because that's the tenant's private medical information, and it can be provided by a reliable third party who's familiar with the tenant's disability. So we think of a letter from a doctor, a school counselor, a physical therapist, a social worker, case manager. All of these are reliable third parties who can provide this verification letter if they do have that relationship with the tenant. And so the second thing that the landlord can consider, let's say that we provided that verification letter, they said, yes, it is necessary for the tenant. The other thing that they can consider is it reasonable for me as the landlord to grant? What reasonable means is, by granting this request as the landlord, would it not create an excessive, a substantial, big administrative or financial burden for the landlord or their agents? And notice how we use the word excessive, big, large, right? It has to be a big burden for them to reject it for that reason. The other thing that the landlord can consider is the request that the tenant has generally within the scope of housing services? And the other thing that they can consider, the last thing, is will it not fundamentally change my business by granting this request? And so why we really go through what a landlord needs to consider is because if a landlord is rejecting tenants for reasons that don't fall into this criteria, that counts as discrimination that you really should report. And so if a landlord considers this and they decide ultimately we can't grant this request, they need to engage in what's called a good faith dialogue, conversation with the tenant to find a reasonable alternative. So I'm sorry we can't grant this. Is there something else that we could grant that would improve accessibility, safety, quality of life for you as a tenant? So no one should be putting in a reasonable accommodation request and not hear back from their landlord ever, right? So we definitely should hear back from our landlord, from our housing provider. And if they don't get back to us, if they ignore us, that can be discrimination. And so once again, just to wrap this up, right, accommodations change to a service or a policy or a rule. A really common accommodation that people may have, right, is actually a service or an emotional support animal. And when it comes to accommodations, the big difference is that the landlord bears the cost or pays any costs needed to grant that request. So tenants should not be paying for their accommodation to be granted. And so when it comes to a service animal or an ESA, an emotional support animal, once granted, tenants should not pay pet rent, pet fees, pet deposits, anything like that to have their accommodation in their housing. When it comes to modifications, physical changes to the unit or the building, the tenant oftentimes does bear the cost of that modification. An exception, though, is in public housing, housing that's paid for by the government. In that type of housing, the provider, the landlord, has to pay for the modification. So some common modifications people request are a wheelchair ramp, grab bar in the bathroom, lowering countertops, installing a visual doorbell. The list goes on, right? There are hundreds of modifications that tenants may request at any point of their tenancy. So you can request something a year into living there, 5 years into living there, 10 years into living there. And this, once again, this whole process is something we can really help you with. Our housing counselors are ready to assist with. All right, so this just kind of sums up what we talked about so far. And all of this would be considered unlawful discrimination, prohibited practices, if they were based on someone's protected class or characteristic. So that could look like refusing to rent or to sell housing to someone because they have a disability or because of their race or any protected class. It could also be having different terms or rules for tenants. So you get a special rental agreement, but no one else does. It can also look like threats, intimidation, harassment, or coercion for exercising your rights. denying a reasonable accommodation or modification if a landlord's not considering the correct criteria. So I know we're kind of at the end of it now, but I just want to provide a few more resources. So we've gone through the fair housing section, and I like to include this in case anyone is looking for affordable housing. There are a few resources that you have, okay? So one of them is that the City of LA has an affordable housing registry online. So the link is here, and I'm happy to share this presentation after we can circulate it, right? So we can all have this available. But you would want to click on this link, and you could look for affordable housing there for the City of LA. There are some other resources here that you can always take a look at. Some of them are for the county, so LA County, as well as all the way into Ventura County. So let's just quickly review, when we're applying for a rental, what can the landlord ask us about? Can they ask about my income as a renter? So the answer is yes, right? We talked about there can be that income standard, but if it's applied incorrectly, that does count as source of income discrimination. Can they ask about my credit? So yes, right? They can ask about credit. But we did talk about that new law in California that says if we're using a government rent subsidy, like Section 8, we have the option of not going through that credit check when we apply for housing and providing alternative evidence instead. Can landlords ask me about where I've lived before? The answer is yes, right? So they can check previous landlord references, and they're really trying to answer the question, has the tenant paid their bills on time? Will they be a good tenant that I can do my business and run my business successfully with? Smoking status. So can landlords ask about my smoking status? The answer is yes, right? And they can reject tenants for that reason. What about pets? So yes, properties can have a no pet policy and reject people for having pets. But there is an exception, right, that we talked about, that if we have a service animal or an emotional support animal, then they have to make exceptions, even if it's a no pet policy property. Can they ask about my family or my kids, right? So generally, landlords can restrict the number of occupants, but not how you're related or if they're your family. So I just want to provide some information on some common issues and your rights, okay? Because these are questions that we get a lot. So landlord entry. So how soon can landlords enter our unit? Essentially, they have to give 24-hour notice before they enter your unit. There is an exception though for when there's an emergency, like a fire or gas leak, they can enter your unit without that 24-hour notice. What do we do if a landlord's not making needed repairs? So the first step that we would do is we want to properly inform the landlord of the issues, okay? So we want to send an email, we want to write a letter, we want to send a text, and we want to keep a copy of that document. Save a picture of it, star that email, but keep that document. If the issue was caused by the tenant, then the tenant is generally responsible for paying for that repair. If the issue, though, is normal wear and tear, it's the amount of damage you would expect if someone's living in a unit for 5 years, 10 years, whatever it may be. So, if the issue's normal wear and tear, the landlord pays for the repair. What do I do if a landlord refuses to do repairs or just never responds to me? You have the right to make a complaint with the city or a county agency, depending on where you live, and our counselors can help you with that process. So just some important tips. We want to make sure that we get everything in writing. Sometimes when we're signing a lease, a landlord may promise something, but it's not in writing, so we can't point to it and enforce it. You also have the right to keep a copy of your lease, and you can request a new one every year if you've lost your copy. You can consider renter's insurance, and landlords may require renter's insurance, and if you sign a lease that says you'll pay it, then you have to. So some final resources. I want to highlight that in the city of LA, we have a local law called the Tenant Anti-Harassment Ordinance, okay? And this is often called TAHO for short. And so, what is illegal harassment? Illegal harassment are intentional, harmful actions with no other purpose than to target specific tenants. That could look like a landlord eliminating services that were originally included in a lease. Or refusing to do repairs, or refusing to acknowledge or accept rent. So what do we do if we're experiencing this? We can always contact our counselors, but you can also just submit a complaint directly to the Los Angeles Housing Department if you live in the city of LA. So landlords, they do face possible fines and criminal penalties if they engage in this illegal harassment. So I just want to give some information on the eviction process. Okay, so we're almost at the end, but if we're going to take one thing from this slide, it's that self-help evictions are illegal. What's a self-help eviction? So a self-help eviction is when a landlord decides, I don't want you as a tenant anymore, and I'm gonna change the locks, or I'm going to turn off your utilities so you can't access your unit. That is illegal, and only a judge can evict a tenant. So part of that legal process is that landlords have to provide a written notice, an eviction notice, before they even file the eviction with the court. That eviction notice, it's a warning, and it's not the eviction itself. So we often see a 3-day notice, a pay or quit notice, which essentially says the tenant has 3 days to pay the rent that they owe, or after those 3 days, the landlord can file that eviction with the court. They can start that process after those 3 days. So it's not the eviction itself. if a landlord files the eviction case with the court, the tenant's gonna know because they're gonna receive a summons from the court. And when they receive this summons, this legal document, they only have 10 business days to respond. So if someone is trying to respond to an eviction case, or they need assistance, right, with an eviction, we do have a group in LA County called Stay Housed LA. So Stay Housed LA, it's a group of organizations with eviction attorneys who essentially are helping out with some of these cases. It's not guaranteed that everyone who applies will be matched with an attorney, but it is really good to apply just to see if you are matched if you're in that situation. They also are offering a ton of free workshops right now, online, in person, which I would encourage someone to attend if they want to learn more about the eviction process. I also want to highlight LA County has some great self-help centers with eviction resources and step-by-step guides. And so we reached the end. I'm putting our contact information on the screen again in case anyone wants to get a hold of our housing counselors. You can give us a call at our Housing Rights Hotline. We also have a TTY number, which is 1213-201-0867. It's on every flyer that we have though, so you don't need to write it down. All right, you can follow us on Instagram if you want, or come to any of our future events, and we would love that. Thank you all. And we can go questions.
Okay, quick question for you. So I wanted to know, so if someone, a renter, does decide to come to the HRC, what kind of proof or evidence do they need to bring to the HRC in order to get assistance with whatever their complaint is or discrimination struggle is that they're having?
So that's a really good question. The truth is you can come with no documentation to start. So even if you just experienced something or you have a question, maybe you haven't even experienced discrimination, and you just have a question about security deposits or your rights when you're renting, you can just come as you are. But if you are trying to report a case of discrimination, I would recommend that you collect emails or whatever documents you can collect, right? So maybe a copy of an email or a lease agreement or whatever's proving that discrimination that you may have, right? So maybe it's an email from a landlord that says, I don't want to talk with you about your accommodation, right? We can't grant that. I don't want to talk with you anymore. That's good evidence to keep and bring with you to talk with our counselors. But you don't need to have it all together to speak with them.
So, no, go ahead. Okay, so just to follow up on that, so would I email the documents that I had to this email?
So it's either way. You can come in person, you could email, or you could call. Whatever's easiest for you. But they are a little bit quicker responding to email right now than they are to voicemail. So I would, if you have a quick thing, you have a quick question, I would recommend sending an email because they may get back to you a day or two faster.
Any other questions? Come on up. Oh, I'm curious, how many requests do you get for flashing lights, for example, accommodations? Typically, we reach out to the fire department to get help with those types of modifications. Do you think that the fire department would be the first step to reach out to, or do you think that getting in touch with HRC would be the first step to get to reach out to?
If contacting
And I'm talking specifically about, doorbells, for example. Hold on 1 second, we're going to rephrase that question in just a moment here. So my doctor had been saying that interpreter missed the first part. Did you catch it, Gary? So my doctor and I were talking about the fact that there's some issues in my surrounding apartment with it being dirty and not a good environment for me, and that I should go to a different apartment where I can work out, gain my strength, but I feel like I am experiencing discrimination because I am deaf and being able to move to another place. I'm not receiving any lists of apartments. I'm 57, or excuse me, I'm 57, but there are 55 plus apartments that I'm interested in, and I'm not being allowed to move into those apartments. I've tried to be in touch with HRC, but I'm not getting contacted back. I'm not able to understand English. I'm not being provided an interpreter as well. So I feel like I'm being discriminated against in order to move into apartments like this. So, I'm trying to get legal assistance as well, but I feel like I'm just receiving no help on this issue. So I'm really looking for some help from the HRC and some guidance in that. I don't know what to do at this point.
Great question, and thank you for explaining that all. So let me get your contact information before we go today, and what I'll do is I'll contact our counselors and I'll have them contact you directly. Okay, so I'll follow up with our counselors, I'll get your contact information, and we'll make sure that you're called by them. We get over 18,000 people reaching out per year, so sometimes those calls do get missed. So I really want to make sure that you get the help you need. You could be experiencing discrimination, and so I want our counselors to ask more questions of you, collect an intake, and really see some next steps. We'll talk more after. I'll get your next step.
you know, there's a lot of deaf folks that need a lot of help in finding new places to live. Some places are $1,500 that are available. That's not a possibility for a lot of us. So I'm not sure why that's the only thing that's available. You know, if I was able to get some type of assistance to be able to move to a place like that, maybe using Section 8, I don't know, but I haven't been able to get that, you know. I've been asking my manager as well, my case manager, to see if I can get a reduction in rent to move to a place like that, but I need help, I'm deaf, I don't know what to do.
So we can provide a few resources for searching for new housing, but the truth is our housing counselors, they're not really navigators, meaning that they can't send you properties that they think would be right for you and help you apply to it. That's a little bit more specialized than what our counselors offer, but what they can do is they can send you resources with some that you can use on your own time to apply to. And one of those resources is probably Project Place, where we have a whole section on where we put the new affordable housing that is accessible that we can find. The problem with affordable housing that we probably know is that it's a lottery a lot of the time, right? So you put your name in the hat and there could be 2,000 people applying for 10 studios, right? So it's really apply to as many as you can and hope you get selected for one.
I mean, the places that you're talking about are still like $1,500, and that feels like discrimination to me, you know? It feels like I don't have the possibility, you know, to move to places like this. I don't know if Fremont might be a better option for me.
So normally high rent prices are not discrimination if they're applied across the board, right? So if everyone has to pay high rent, it's not discrimination, but if people based on race or disability had to pay higher rent, it would be.
You know, but these rents should be under $800. $1,500 doesn't even make sense to me. You know, I'm just confused at this point. And I'm not happy.
But we have some questions around. We have a gentleman up the front and the back.
So I have 2 questions for you. So all of the programs you're mentioning are really good. But yesterday, my friend had talked to me about rent all over the U.S. is so different than in California. You know, here, that things are $2,000, things are getting updated all the time, and that's an issue, and I wonder why California is so different. Rent in my area specifically, the landlords were previously very good, but I'm noticing that they're selling these places to other landlords. Sometimes they're from China, for example. There's been a lot of problems, a lot of complaints year over year. People have been moving out, and these new landlords are coming in and they're hiring these property managers that are just not very good. So how to solve the problem of these property managers? You know, we have rights for them to fix these issues and solve the problems that we have and do the renovations that we need. And I think a lot of these problems are starting to be solved, which is very good news. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with the technology that we have. So, I mean, I did want to say something positive about it.
Well, thank you for for sharing that. And this is a really good opportunity because our presentation today, it wasn't about rent control or anything like that, but it is really, really important to know in the city of LA, of course, right, we do have rent stabilization, also known as rent control. What that means is that if you live in the city of LA and most of the rental properties in the city of LA fall under this law, okay? An easy way to figure out if the property you're living in has this protection applied in the city of LA is actually to call the Los Angeles Housing Department. And when you call them, you can ask and you can say, hey, I'm a renter and I want to know, is this rent increase legal? Is this eviction reason legal? What are my rights in this scenario? And that city department is the one in charge of those. So you can also complain to them, right? You can submit a formal complaint if your landlord's trying to raise the rent to evict you or doing things that are bad business practices, right? You do have that outlet to report that as a complaint to the housing department. And so for instance, in the city of LA right now, right, we have that rent control applied, and I believe it's like 3% is the most it can go up this year. So it's 3% plus 1% for gas and 1% for electricity, right? So people's rent should not be going up 12% this year or anything like that. And if it is, if our neighbor tells us that, or friend, we want to encourage them to look into that and make sure it's legal. I think we had some questions in the back as well.
So I have a question for you. So if it happened that we had some lights in the roof and perhaps they kind of fell out and the situation was dangerous, perhaps it was going to fall to the floor. We contacted the landlord, let them know it's getting delayed over and over again. We're letting them know this is a dangerous situation, that it might fall. What do we do?
If you're in the city of LA, or any city, but if you're in the city of LA, I would recommend that you file a complaint with the city's code enforcement department. So you have the right to make a complaint to the code enforcement department for anything that's not up to code, right? In your rental unit, of the property for your rental unit. I recently had to call code enforcement. I live in LA because my balcony railing was loose, right? And my landlord was not responding. And I had to have code enforcement send an inspector out to the property for free. And they look at the property, at the issues, and they tell the landlord, you have a month or whatever that time is to fix the issue. And so you're getting the city involved, so you're not fighting it alone, right? Landlords then face some penalties and also added pressure from the city. So that's for anything not up to code. I often, especially we're going into winter, we're gonna get more rain. We sometimes get the question, what do we do if we have a leak or mold in our apartment, right, from the rain, and the landlord's just doing the landlord special and painting it over, right? In that scenario, you want to make actually a complaint to the county's public health department. So anything that affects our health, like mold, bugs, dampness, right, in our unit that's affecting us, we can report that to the public health department. And they'll send an inspector out to the property in the same way.
I don't know if you answered this question already, but I'm going to answer again, or ask it again. A lot of folks have asked about noise as far as knocking on the door. For us, we are referred to the fire department for getting lighted doorbells. And again, we aren't sure if we should be going to the fire department as our first step for a referral, or if getting the accommodation from you all would be a better first step.
I would say contact our counselors first. just to make sure that you know all of your rights and that they can collect that info for that situation. Because a visual doorbell, like what you're describing, right, that's flashing lights, that's actually a modification, okay? So it's a physical change to the unit or the building, right? In those scenarios, depending on the type of housing you're in, so if you're in public housing, the housing provider actually has to pay for it and provide that. It's on the landlord to do that. But if you're in private housing, like we just call up a random landlord and we're living at their property, right? It's actually on the tenant for getting that installed and paying for it, but you can put that request in as a modification request in both scenarios.
So what would be the difference then? Because, you know, if one of them is private housing versus public housing, I don't really see why we would have to be the ones to pay for that versus having the modification provided.
So it really comes down to specific laws that were passed that said any landlords who are operating public housing or government-funded housing have to provide more, essentially. It's better, right, than just the requirements that are on private landlords who are renting out their homes. So there's stronger requirements for those new buildings, for public housing, a lot of the affordable housing programs, right? In those scenarios, right, you have stronger protections there.
Thank you. So I had a question about an apartment, for example. So I have 3 kids. And it's one moment, the interpreter's gonna really quick. So I have 3 kids, and I'm limited in the apartments that I can have because we have a family and the occupancy in those apartments is limited. But we're not able to afford, you know, to get a house that is larger in size to fit our family occupancy. The landlord is telling us that we're limited because of that. So we've been searching and searching to find a larger apartment. But that's not been possible for us, so we're not exactly sure what to do. Interpreter's just clarifying. But as we were saying before, that the apartment is not supposed to be limiting how many kids that we have. You know, we don't have any adults in the house other than us, of course. But we have, you know, under 18, we have minors in the house, so we can't have them living in another space. But they keep telling us over and over again that we can't. So we are looking for another apartment that has 2 bedrooms. We really, really need to find that.
So it can be familial status discrimination, and for that reason, I really want you to contact our housing counselor so they can ask more questions, kind of in a private setting, and really see if that discrimination is happening. So one thing I just want to let you know though, okay, so in California, we do have something called the Uniform Housing Code, and it essentially says the occupancy limits that generally should be followed. It's not in every case, right? So someone could have a really big studio apartment in downtown LA that would be fine for a lot of people to live in. But, so the general rule is 2 people per bedroom plus 1 for the living space, okay? So we call it the 2 plus 1 rule. 2 people for a bedroom, 1 for the living room. So a 2-bedroom would, in theory, right, fit 5 people. It's 2 per bedroom, 1 for the living room space. But it still could be discriminatory the way the landlord's talking to you or forcing you out because you have children, right? So that's why I really want you to speak with our housing counselors to make sure that your rights are respected. We have a question for that.
So I was wondering, there's a lot of places that are really, really old. I was wondering if it's possible to find a place that has an office in it, or find a better building. Excuse the interpreter. I'm wondering if you could help us find a better office building and that we could move to instead of being in this location.
So our counselors, they're not navigators. So we're not navigators. So that basically means that we can't find housing specifically for you, right? Our staff can't do that. But they can provide some resources where you could look at some new housing and decide if you want to apply.
So something that would include living upstairs and would also have an office as well. So it would be like an office building included. So would that be something that would be okay for us to work with the HRC to find resources for?
So we can definitely provide you resources, and those resources will look like properties, just maybe in a list or in Project Place, right, our newsletter, where you can look through them and then decide if you want to apply. But our housing counselors, they're not gonna they're not gonna like fill out the application for you or help you look for the perfect bedroom, right? But they can give you some resources to start that search.
And again, this isn't going to be for me. This would be for the office building.
Oh, okay,
Would you
that's
mind
great.
helping us explain this? Yeah, so this building here is really, really old, but it does have 14 units above for 55 and older deaf folks. That's included, and then under here we're able to have our office building. So then there are services for the deaf organization here. So she's essentially asking if there are available options that HRC could help us search for that are a cleaner version, that doesn't have bugs, that doesn't have leaks, essentially. There's just so much that's going on here. So, that's what we're wondering. We want something that's newer, better, cheaper. I don't know. It's a lot to ask, but we've just been having so many problems. We just want something good. So I don't know if that's something now that you're with us.
I can tell you our team probably is not going to be able to help find the new spot. I wish we could. I would help personally just on my own time because it sounds fun. But I know our staff, they're not at the capacity to do that, unfortunately.
So you're willing to help.
Yeah, I'm willing to help, but HRC can't help, yeah.
And I'm living upstairs, so I need you to help us out. That's awesome.
I have to say I love the area here though, it's so nice. All right.
So she's wondering about deaf housing that already has doorbells installed, already has all of the things that you know, we would be looking for modifications, we would be looking for that. We wouldn't necessarily have to worry about getting those installed or asking for those things. You know, lights, for example, so that we wouldn't have to buy them or wouldn't have to seek them out. Is there any kind of help we could get in finding help with getting installed lights or video phones, for example? You know, something that could be like a deaf glad community, I don't know, I'm trying to think of what we could call it. And she's saying, well, I'm trying to talk about something else. So I'm really specifically talking about things getting installed in housing. So I'm wondering about options related to that.
So definitely contact our counselors.
And would, I think something needs to be done. This building in particular is close to being 100 years old, and it's not a safe place. It's not a safe place for us to be. But we live here.
So you can definitely contact our counselors, right? Especially about making those requests to make it more accessible for yourself. So this is free, private, confidential. They have sample letters and things like that to help with those requests. There aren't enough new buildings being developed, you know, that are fully equipped and ready and are accessible, unfortunately. But you can make any change to a current building.
But the fact that we have to pay for these things, if we move to a newer building, a newer home, that was going to be a community space for deaf folks, especially. Plus getting our video phones installed, you know, our doorbells installed, getting the wiring already included would be such an improvement for the deaf community and those types of deaf spaces where we know folks are going to be there in one place. I wanted to add as well, so this is related to LA City, right? Is that true? Yeah, so this is related to being a city building. So I'm wondering, is that something that you and your organization would be included in, or would this be, because of that, be a separate entity?
So we serve LA, but we're not the city. So we're just a nonprofit, right? So we serve LA, we know a lot about LA laws and requirements, but we also serve outside of LA. So we serve all of LA County as well.
Okay, secondly, for example, our dryer, for example, it doesn't have a timer on it, so we don't know when it's gonna finish. We wanna be able to buy certain things that are cheaper, that are nicer, that'll help our facility because, you know, we're going back and forth, trying to figure out just when our clothes are dry, you know? And I feel like deaf folks here having to go downstairs is, you know, to do this over and over is just kind of silly.
Yeah. So contact us, especially about the laundry and some other ideas that you have for modifications that would make the building more accessible, right? And you can contact our counselors with those questions, and they can let you know if that's a reasonable modification, something that you can request, or what that process would look like. Because especially laundry rooms, community spaces, you can make modifications in those spaces outside of your unit as well.
I mean, I think it's a money issue. The cost is what's not reasonable.
Yeah.
I think it's crazy at this point what stuff costs. You know, I don't know if there's a way for us to get lowered costs on equipment like this.
I wish. I mean, nothing that I know. I wish I did.
All right.
It's a good
well, that's all
question.
I wanted to ask. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I did also want to bring up the 3 times the income that you had mentioned. So for California law, you had mentioned that, I thought that it had changed to just 1 time the income. So I'm confused at those 2 differences.
So we were talking about the income standard, right? Which is when you're applying to a property, it's the proof that you can pay enough, right? To live there month after month. Security deposits are different though. So the security deposit, right? Actually, I think what you're thinking of is it was recently changed and lowered to only 1 month's rent. So that means that like when we're applying and we have this space and we provide a security deposit, it's only 1 month's rent now for most properties.
So that is just 1 month's income. That is not a 3-month income.
So the security deposit is 1 month's rent. So however much, let's say you're paying $1,000 for rent, you would give $1,000 for the security deposit, and that's your money that should be returned when you leave, right?
Mm-hmm. But the PowerPoint said 3 times your income.
So
that's the security deposit.
So the 3 times your income, you're not paying.
Oh, okay.
It's just, you're just proving you make every month 3 times what you have to pay for rent.
Okay.
Good
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. This has been a great conversation. And we have one more question.
I'm really surprised. I was looking at the upstairs floor for senior citizens that they're talking about, and I did see the doorbell, so I'm surprised to be seeing these complaints. I think updates in technology, I understand. But my apartment, for example, I have the Ring doorbell, for example, so I paid for that. I mean, I set that up and I paid for that myself. So that, shows me when the doorbell's ringing, that shows me when anything's going on in my apartment. I also have an alarm on my bed, so I think maybe folks are really hoping that they could have some updates, and I wonder if a doctor's note might help them get some of these updates done.
So definitely you can make those updates. You just put in a reasonable modification request with that doctor's note, and then your landlord just has to consider it and should allow it if it's reasonable to grant.
Yeah, fire alarms as well, and I forget the word for the technology, but when you smell the gas, that alarm, sometimes they go for 10 years, they expire, right? And so there's 2 of them that we have. We have like one in the kitchen, one in the bedroom, and the property manager, who's great now, like I explained, is able to replace those.
That's good.
So we ran out of time. We've got to wrap up at this point.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you so much. We appreciate. I just want to say thank you so much for your patience. Your presentation was wonderful. I enjoyed it so much. It was fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you.
And we really appreciate it. Thanks so much.